The silence in the mountains of Montana was not empty. It was a living thing, thick as fog, heavy as grief. It pressed against the walls of the cabin, seeped through the gaps in the window frames, and settled into the lungs of the man who had come here to disappear. Garrett Hayes stood at the kitchen counter, a chipped mug of black coffee cooling in his hands. 35 years old, 6 feet tall, lean in the way men get when they forget to eat when food becomes fuel and nothing more. His brown hair, cut military short out of habit, showed the first silver threads at the temples. His face held the kind of lines that come from squinting into desert sun and clenching jaw muscles through sleepless nights. He had been here 4 months, 123 days since he'd driven his pickup truck up the winding Forest Service road, past the last cell tower, past the last mailbox, past the last sign of human civilization. 123 days since he'd unlocked the door to his grandfather's cabin and stepped into the smell of cedar and dust and memories that weren't his own. The cabin was small, one main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen alcove with a propane stove, a bedroom barely big enough for the iron frame bed, and a bathroom added sometime in the 70s. The logs were dark with age, weathered by decades of Montana winters. His grandfather, Silas Hayes, had built it with his own hands in 1968 after he came back from a war that had taken something from him no one could name. Garrett understood that now. He understood it in his bones. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending shadows dancing across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the December wind moved through the pines with a sound like ocean waves. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, adding another foot to the already waist-deep drifts that surrounded the cabin. The world beyond the windows was a study in white and gray and the dark vertical lines of tree trunks. He set down the coffee mug, picked up the axe from beside the door, pulled on his brown leather jacket, the same one his grandfather had worn left unzipped over a faded flannel shirt, stepped into his boots without lacing them and pushed open the heavy oak door. The cold hit him like a fist. 20 below zero easy. The kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals that made the inside of your nose freeze with the first inhale. He welcomed it. Cold was honest. Cold didn't lie. Cold didn't pretend to care. He crossed the small clearing to the woodpile, his boots punching through the snow crust with each step. The axe felt good in his hands. Familiar. He selected a log from the stack, set it on the chopping block, and raised the axe overhead. The blade fell. The log split clean down the middle. The sound echoed off the surrounding trees and died in the snow-muffled air. Again and again and again. This was his routine now. Chop wood, haul water from the creek before it froze solid, check the snares he'd set for rabbits, tend the fire, eat when he remembered, sleep when exhaustion finally won. And in between, in the long hours when the silence grew too loud, he would stare into the flames and try not to think about Fallujah. Try not to think about the sound of twisting metal and the smell of burning diesel and the voice of Sergeant Wyatt Coleman screaming his name. The nightmare always started the same way. The Humvee ahead of them hits the IED. The explosion is a column of fire and black smoke that mushrooms into the Iraqi sky. Garrett's vehicle screeches to a halt. His team is already moving, already shouting, already doing what they were trained to do. But Garrett sits frozen behind the wheel, his hands locked on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the overturned Humvee 50 meters ahead. He can see movement inside. He can hear screaming. "Hayes, move your ass!" That's his lieutenant, already out and running toward the wreckage. Garrett's training says get to cover. Training says there might be a secondary device. Training says wait for EOD, wait for the all clear. Wait for someone else to make the call. So he waits. 3 minutes. That's how long he sits there while his team pulls 2 Marines from the burning vehicle. That's how long he remains frozen while Wyatt Coleman, trapped in the driver's seat with both legs crushed, screams for help that doesn't come fast enough. By the time Garrett finally moves, finally forces his legs to work and his hands to let go of the wheel, it's too late. The secondary explosion, the one his training warned him about, never comes. But the fire does its work anyway. He always woke up at the same point. The moment when he reaches the Humvee and sees Wyatt's face through the shattered windshield. The moment when he understands what his fear has cost. Garrett split another log, then another. Sweat froze on his forehead despite the cold. His breath came in ragged clouds. The physical exhaustion helped. It was the only thing that helped. He didn't hear the footsteps. One moment he was alone in the white silence. The next something moved at the edge of his vision. He spun, axe-raised heart hammering. A dog stood at the tree line. German shepherd. Male. Gray and white coat matted with ice and something darker. The animal swayed on its feet, took one unsteady step forward, and collapsed into the snow. Garrett was moving before conscious thought caught up. He dropped the axe and ran his boots slipping on the icy ground. He reached the dog in seconds and dropped to his knees beside it. Blood. Fresh blood already freezing in the sub-zero air, staining the white snow crimson. The dog's left flank had a gash nearly 8 inches long, the edges clean and straight. Too clean. Not a claw mark, not a bite. A cut, made by something sharp, made by human hands. The dog's eyes opened, one amber, one milky white with blindness. The seeing eye found Garrett's face and held it. There was intelligence there. Desperation, a plea that needed no words. Easy, Garrett heard himself say. His voice sounded strange, rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken aloud in days. Easy, boy. I've got you. He ran his hands over the dog's body with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic. More wounds, smaller cuts on the shoulders and back, and around both front legs hidden under the thick fur, raw chafed skin in perfect circles. Rope burns, or wire. Someone had tied this animal. Someone had cut it. Someone had hurt it deliberately and methodically. A cold rage different from the Montana winter settled into Garrett's chest. The dog made a sound, a low whine that vibrated with pain. It tried to lift its head, failed, and let it fall back into the snow. Stay with me, Chimo, Garrett said. He slid his arms under the animal's body, 70, maybe 80 pounds, and lifted. The dog didn't fight, didn't have the strength left to fight. Garrett carried it across the clearing, kicked open the cabin door, and laid the animal on the bearskin rug in front of the fireplace. The warmth from the fire began immediately to melt the ice from the dog's coat, revealing more of the damage underneath. He worked fast. The old military first aid kit was in the bedroom closet exactly where Silas had kept it. Garrett's hands moved through familiar motions. Cleanse the wounds. Apply antiseptic that made the dog's muscles tense and shake. Stitch the deep gash with the curved needle and thread. Bandage what could be bandaged. The dog never made a sound, just watched him with that one good eye, ancient and full of something that looked like understanding. When it was done, Garrett sat back on his heels. The shaking in his hands came from somewhere deeper than cold or exertion. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady. Its eye had closed. In sleep or unconsciousness, Garrett couldn't tell. He reached out and rested his hand on the animal's neck, feeling the pulse beneath the fur. Still there, still fighting. You picked the right door, Garrett said quietly. Don't make me regret opening it. The storm outside intensified. Wind howled down the chimney and rattled the shutters. Snow hissed against the windows like thrown sand. The world contracted to this single room, this circle of firelight, this man, and this wounded animal breathing in rhythm. Garrett didn't remember falling asleep in the old armchair, but when he opened his eyes, the fire had burned down to embers, and pale gray light filtered through the frost-covered windows. Morning, maybe 8 o'clock, judging by the angle of the light. He sat up, his neck stiff from the awkward angle. His first thought was the dog. The bearskin rug was empty. Panic flared, irrational and immediate. Then he saw it. The German shepherd stood at the window, the large one that faced north into the deep forest. Every muscle in the dog's body was tense despite the injuries. The bandages Garrett had applied were still in place, dark with dried blood but holding. The dog wasn't looking at Garrett. It was staring through the glass into the trees beyond. Hey, Garrett said softly. You should be resting. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it didn't turn, didn't move. Just continued that fixed, unwavering stare into the wilderness. Garrett rose from the chair, his joints protesting, and crossed to the window. He looked out at what the dog was seeing. Nothing. Just trees and snow and the endless white silence of the Montana backcountry. No movement. No tracks. No sign of anything living. What is it, boy? What do you see? The dog made a sound that blended whine and growl into something more urgent. A sound of desperate plea that raised the hair on the back of Garrett's neck. He'd heard dogs in combat. Military working dogs trained to detect explosives and insurgents and danger that humans couldn't sense. He'd seen them alert to threats invisible to every other member of the patrol. He'd learned to trust that alert. This was that same sound. Easy, Garrett said. He reached out slowly and rested his hand on the dog's back. The muscles beneath the fur were coiled tight as springs. Easy, nothing out there but snow. But the dog didn't relax. And somewhere deep in Garrett's gut, in the part of him that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Iraq, something said the dog was right to worry. He made coffee, fed more wood to the fire, heated up a can of stew, and ate half of it standing at the counter, forcing down food his body didn't want. All the while, the dog remained at the window, watching, waiting. Garrett filled a bowl with water and set it on the floor near the bearskin rug. "Drink," he said. "You need fluids." The dog ignored him. He tried a different approach. Opened a tin of beef jerky, his dwindling supply from town, and set several pieces on a plate. The smell filled the small cabin, rich and salty, and impossible for any dog to ignore. The German shepherd's nose twitched. Its head turned slightly, acknowledging the food's existence. Then it returned its gaze to the window. "Stubborn," Garrett muttered, but there was something like respect in his voice. The day passed in strange suspension. The storm blew itself out by noon, leaving behind a world wrapped in pristine white silence. The sun emerged pale and cold, turning the snow to blinding diamonds. And still the dog stood vigil at the window. Garrett tried to distract it, tried calling it away, tried everything short of physically moving it. The dog would look at him with that seeing eye, a gaze so full of desperate communication it bordered on human, and then returned to its watch. By nightfall, Garrett had to face a truth he'd been avoiding. This wasn't random behavior. This wasn't a traumatized animal lost in its own fear. This was purpose. This was a mission. The dog knew something, needed something, was trying with every fiber of its being to tell him something that no amount of barking or whining could convey. He knelt beside the animal as darkness settled over the mountains. The dog's body trembled with exhaustion and pain, but still it stood. Still it stared into the north. "You're trying to tell me something," Garrett said quietly. "Aren't you?" The seeing eye found his face. In the firelight, it seemed to glow with an intensity that was almost painful. And in that moment, Garrett could have sworn the animal nodded. He'd read once that the old tribes believed dogs could see things humans couldn't. Spirits, danger, truth hidden beneath the surface of the world. He'd dismissed it as superstition. But kneeling here in his grandfather's cabin looking into that eye, he wondered if maybe the old tribes had understood something the modern world had forgotten. "Okay," Garrett said. "Okay, I hear you. But you need to rest first. Whatever it is, it can wait until you're stronger." This time, as if some agreement had been reached, the dog finally moved. It turned from the window, walked stiffly to the water bowl, and drank deeply. Then it ate 3 pieces of jerky with careful, deliberate bites. Finally, it lowered itself onto the bearskin rug and laid its head on its paws. But the eye remained open, watchful, waiting. Garrett checked the dog's wounds before heading to bed. The stitches held, no sign of infection. Against all odds, the animal was healing with remarkable speed. Youth and strength and maybe something else. The same stubborn will that kept it standing at that window for 12 straight hours. He left the bedroom door open, a signal of trust he hadn't extended to another living creature in 4 months. As he lay in his grandfather's old bed staring at the ceiling beams, he heard the dog shift on the rug, heard the soft padding of paws on wood. The German shepherd appeared in the bedroom doorway. It looked at Garrett for a long moment, some assessment being made that Garrett couldn't decipher. Then it crossed to the side of the bed and lay down on the floor close enough that Garrett could have reached down and touched it. A guard position. Protective. Loyal. Something cracked in Garrett's chest. Some small piece of the ice he'd built around himself. "You don't owe me anything," he said to the darkness. "I just did what anyone would do." The dog sighed, a deep, shuddering breath that sounded almost human in its weariness. And for the first time in 123 days, Garrett Hayes fell asleep without the nightmare of Fallujah waiting for him. He woke to absolute silence. No wind, no creaking logs, no sound at all except the slow rhythm of his own breathing and something else. A soft, persistent whining. Garrett opened his eyes. The room was dark, but not the full black of true night. Pre-dawn, maybe 4 or 5 in the morning. The dog stood at the bedroom window now, the one that also faced north. Same rigid posture, same fixed stare. But this time the whining was constant, desperate. A sound that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to something primal. Garrett sat up. "What is it?" The dog turned its head, looked at him with an intensity that was almost accusatory, as if to say, "How can you not hear it? How can you not feel it?" He got out of bed, pulled on his jeans and boots, and joined the dog at the window. The dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The forest stretched out before them, an ocean of pines and snow, beautiful and merciless and empty of all human presence. Except. Garrett's eyes, trained to spot the unnatural in natural landscapes, caught something. A thin line of gray against the pale morning sky, barely visible. Miles away, deep in the wilderness. Smoke. Not the diffuse gray of morning mist, not the white of snow sublimating in sunlight. This was the dark gray of wood smoke. A fire, a chimney, a structure, and it was coming from the exact direction the dog had been staring at for the past 18 hours. The German shepherd looked up at Garrett. The seeing eye held his gaze. The whining stopped. And in the sudden silence, Garrett understood with perfect clarity what the dog had been trying to tell him since the moment it collapsed in his snow. Someone was out there. Someone the dog knew. Someone who needed help. "Show me," Garrett heard himself say. The words surprised him. He'd come to this mountain to hide, to disappear, to let the world forget he existed. The last thing he wanted was to be responsible for another human life. But looking into that eye, seeing the desperate plea there, he knew he didn't have a choice. Some debts couldn't be paid to the person you owed them to. Sometimes you paid them forward to strangers, to animals, to whoever fate put in your path. Maybe that was what his grandfather had understood. Maybe that was why Silas Hayes had built this cabin in the middle of nowhere and filled it with supplies and left it waiting for someone who needed it. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about not making the same mistake twice. Garrett rested his hand on the dog's head. The fur was soft and warm. "Okay, boy, okay, I'll trust you, but first we need to know what we're walking into." He spent the next hour in methodical preparation. Old habits, Marine Corps habits coming back like muscle memory. He couldn't go into an unknown situation unprepared. Not again, not ever again. The closet in the bedroom held his grandfather's old gear. Garrett pulled it out piece by piece, testing it, evaluating it. A backpack military surplus from the 70s, but still serviceable. A canteen, a first aid kit more comprehensive than the one he'd used on the dog. Waterproof matches and fire starter. High-calorie protein bars. Water purification tablets. And in the back of the closet, wrapped in oilcloth, his grandfather's hunting rifle. A Winchester Model 70.30-06 caliber, the wood stock worn smooth from decades of use. Garrett unwrapped it slowly. The metal gleamed despite its age. Silas had taken care of this weapon the way Marines took care of their rifles. With respect, with reverence. A box of ammunition sat beside it. Garrett loaded the rifle with practiced efficiency, checked the action, and set it aside. He hoped he wouldn't need it, but hope had never kept anyone alive. The dog watched all of this from the bedroom doorway, alert, patient, as if it understood that preparation was necessary, that rushing into the unknown was how people died. When the pack was ready, Garrett turned his attention to the dog's wounds. He changed the bandages, carefully checking for any sign of infection. The gash on the flank was healing cleanly, the stitches holding. The rope burns were scabbing over. Whatever trauma this animal had endured, it was healing fast. "You shouldn't be doing this," Garrett said as he worked. "You should be resting for another week at least. But you're not going to let me go alone, are you?" The dog's tail gave a single definitive wag. Garrett fashioned makeshift booties from canvas and duct tape protection for the dog's injured paws against the deep snow. The dog tolerated this with the patience of an animal who'd worn gear before. Not a working dog, not military, but trained, loved. Someone had cared for this animal, taught it. And that someone was out there in the wilderness sending up smoke signals into the winter sky. Before they left, Garrett did one more thing. He went to the mantel over the fireplace where a small wooden box sat among his grandfather's few possessions. Inside was a handful of items: a medal from the Vietnam War, a faded photograph of a young woman, a tarnished wedding ring, and a letter, the envelope yellowed with age, addressed in his grandfather's handwriting to someone named Iris. Garrett had found the box his first week in the cabin. He'd opened the letter, read it once, and put it away unsettled by the raw emotion in the words. His grandfather had been a quiet man, stoic to the point of silence. The letter revealed a different person. Someone who had loved deeply and lost completely and spent a lifetime living with that loss. Now Garrett took the photograph. The woman in it was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and a smile that seemed to hold secrets. On the back, in faded ink, Iris, 1972. He didn't know why he tucked the photograph into his jacket pocket. Some instinct, some feeling he couldn't name, as if his grandfather's past and this moment were connected by threads he couldn't yet see. The sun was fully up when they stepped out of the cabin. The temperature had climbed to a brutal 15 below zero. The sky was a hard, brittle blue, the kind of cold weather sky that promised no mercy and no forgiveness. Garrett shouldered the pack, checked the rifle one more time, and looked down at the dog. Last chance to change your mind. The German Shepherd was already moving, trotting toward the tree line with a purposeful gait that showed no hesitation. Its path was arrow straight, north, always north. But then the dog did something that stopped Garrett cold. It turned back, walked to the cabin door with deliberate steps, and rose on its hind legs. Its front paws pressed against the doorframe, and it looked at Garrett with an expression of such clear intent that it bordered on human. "What is it?" The dog dropped down to walk to Garrett and tugged gently at his jacket with its teeth. Then it went back to the door. The message was clear. There was something inside they needed. Garrett followed the dog back into the cabin, puzzled. The dog crossed directly to the wall where Garrett had tacked an old topographical map of the Montana wilderness. It was Silas's map, yellowed with age, marked with faded pencil lines showing trails and landmarks. The dog stood on its hind legs again, its nose touching the map at a specific point, then looked back at Garrett. When Garrett didn't move, the dog repeated the gesture. Nose to map, look back. Garrett's heart began to beat faster. "Show me." The dog's paw, the right one less injured than the left, lifted and pressed against the map. Not random, not accidental. The pad landed on a marked area labeled Timber Ridge North, 15 miles. Due north, the exact direction the dog had been staring at for 7 days straight. Garrett felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Dogs didn't read maps. Dogs didn't understand symbols on paper. But this dog did. Or maybe he didn't understand the map at all. Maybe he just knew bone deep that humans use these paper things to find places, and he was desperate enough to try any form of communication. "Timber Ridge," Garrett said softly. He looked at the dog. The seeing eye held his gaze with an intensity that was almost painful. "That's where we're going. That's where she is." The dog's tail wagged, just once, but it was enough. They set out for real this time. As they reached the tree line, Garrett paused and spoke words he hadn't meant to say. The kind of words that felt dangerous because they acknowledged something larger than himself. "Lord," he said quietly, the first prayer he'd spoken since the day of Wyatt's funeral, "if this is where I'm meant to be, show me the way. And if I'm about to do something stupid, at least let it count for something." The dog looked back at him, waiting. Garrett stepped off the porch and into the deep snow. The first step was the hardest. After that, it was just putting one foot in front of the other, following a wounded animal into the frozen wilderness on nothing more than faith and the distant promise of smoke on the horizon. The silence of the mountains swallowed them whole. The forest was older than nations, older than the wars that had scarred Garrett Hayes, and older than the grief that had driven him into its embrace. Ponderosa pines towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow that had accumulated over weeks of winter storms. The spaces between the trees were cathedral-like in their stillness, columns of dark bark rising into a canopy that filtered the morning light into shafts of pale gold. The dog Garrett had started thinking of him as Boone, though he didn't know where the name came from, moved through this wilderness with the confidence of a creature who knew exactly where he was going. His gait was steady despite the injuries, his path unwavering. He would stop occasionally, lift his nose to test the wind, and then continue with renewed purpose. The makeshift booties on his paws left strange tracks in the pristine snow, but they were doing their job, protecting the raw skin beneath. Garrett followed. The pack on his back weighed maybe 30 pounds, the rifle slung over his shoulder another 8. Not heavy by military standards, but the deep snow made every step an effort. His thighs burned. His breath came in white clouds that froze on his beard. Sweat formed under his layers of clothing, despite the brutal cold. They'd been walking for an hour when Boone stopped at the edge of a frozen stream. The dog stood perfectly still, his body tense, his head lowered. The hackles on his neck rose slowly. Garrett unslung the rifle and dropped to one knee, scanning the surrounding forest. Nothing moved. No sound except the whisper of wind through pine needles and his own carefully controlled breathing. "What is it?" he whispered. Boone's nose worked the air. The dog took 3 careful steps forward, then stopped again. He was tracking something through scent alone. Garrett's eyes swept the tree line. There, 20 meters ahead, barely visible against the snow-covered ground. Footprints. Human footprints. Old ones mostly filled in by subsequent snowfall, but still discernible. A single track heading in the same direction they were traveling. He moved forward slowly, keeping the rifle ready. When he reached the tracks, he knelt and examined them. Boot prints, size 10, maybe 11. Deep impressions, meaning the person had been carrying weight. The stride length was irregular, 1 foot dragging slightly, injured or exhausted. The tracks were at least a month old, judging by the accumulation of snow and ice in the depressions. Whoever had made them had been out here during the last major storm, in conditions that would have killed most people within hours. Garrett looked up at Boone. The dog was watching him, that seeing eye holding steady, waiting for him to understand. "Someone else was looking," Garrett said quietly. "Someone else tried to find whoever's out there." The dog's tail lowered, a subtle signal of agreement or perhaps sorrow. They continued on. The terrain grew more difficult. The gentle slopes of the cabin's valley gave way to steeper ground. They climbed through draws choked with deadfall and descended into ravines where the snow had drifted to shoulder height. Garrett used the rifle as a walking stick, testing the depth before committing his weight. His military training came back without conscious thought. Scan the terrain for cover. Identify the high ground. Mark landmarks for navigation. Note the position of the sun. Count steps to estimate distance. All the skills drilled into him during basic training, refined in the California desert, tested in the Iraqi cities, now applied to a Montana wilderness. Boone never hesitated. The dog seemed to have a map written in his bones, an internal compass that pointed true north with unwavering certainty. Garrett found himself trusting that certainty more than his own judgment. They stopped once in a small clearing, sheltered by a massive fallen pine. Garrett checked his watch, 11:30. They'd been traveling for 3.5 hours and covered maybe 6 miles. Slow going, but steady. He pulled out 2 protein bars and a canteen. The water inside had stayed liquid barely thanks to the insulation of his pack. He drank carefully, letting the near-freezing water warm in his mouth before swallowing. Then he broke off half of one protein bar and offered it to Boone. The dog took it gently from his gloved hand and chewed slowly, his gaze never leaving the direction they'd been traveling. Garrett ate his own food mechanically. His body needed fuel even if his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about those footprints, about whoever had walked this same path weeks ago, about the fact that they'd never made it back. "You knew them," he said to Boone. "Didn't you? The person who made those tracks. They were looking for the same thing we are." The dog finished eating and moved to Garrett's side. He rested his head against Garrett's knee, a gesture of both affection and urgency. They couldn't stay long. Every minute of daylight was precious. Garrett ran his hand over the dog's head, feeling the warmth beneath the fur. "Okay, we keep moving, but you need to tell me if you need to rest. I can't carry you and the gear both." They set off again. The sun climbed higher, but its warmth was an illusion. The temperature remained locked in the bitter range that made exposed skin go numb within minutes. Garrett's face ached. His fingers, even inside the thick gloves, felt wooden and clumsy. The forest changed as they climbed higher. The pines thinned. Aspen groves appeared, their white bark stark against the snow, their branches bare and skeletal. The silence deepened, not even the sound of birds. Just the crunch of snow under boots and paws, and the occasional crack of a distant tree branch breaking under the weight of accumulated ice. It was in one of these aspen groves that Boone stopped again. This time his entire body went rigid, his lip curled back, revealing teeth. A low growl rumbled in his chest, primal and warning. Garrett brought the rifle up immediately. His finger rested along the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. Safety discipline beaten into him by 1,000 hours on the range. Don't put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to destroy whatever you're aiming at. He scanned left to right, looking for movement, for color, for anything that didn't belong. The aspen grove was maybe 50 meters across the pale trunks, creating a maze of vertical lines. Perfect place for an ambush. Perfect place to die if you weren't careful. Then he smelled it, faint but unmistakable. Gasoline. The scent was wrong for this place. Chemical and sharp, cutting through the clean smell of snow and pine. Garrett's pulse kicked up. Gasoline meant humans, meant engines, meant someone had been here recently enough that the scent hadn't fully dissipated. Boone's growl intensified. The dog took 2 steps forward, then stopped, his nose working frantically. "Easy," Garrett whispered. "Show me." The dog moved slowly through the aspen grove, weaving between the white trunks. Garrett followed the rifle, now at his shoulder eye, to the scope, scanning through the magnification for any sign of threat. They found it at the far edge of the grove, a clearing maybe 20 feet across, and in the center, barely visible under a thin layer of fresh snow, a pattern of darker patches. Garrett knelt and brushed the snow away carefully. Steel spikes. 4 of them driven into the frozen ground in a rough square, each one about 10 inches tall and sharpened to a vicious point. The tops had been dipped in something dark. Gasoline mixed with dirt or maybe feces. Anything to cause infection if the spikes penetrated flesh. A trap. Crude but effective, designed to cripple, to wound, to slow down anyone or anything that wandered through this clearing. Garrett sat back on his heels, his breath coming faster. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't some abandoned hunting setup. This was recent. This was deliberate. And this was meant to stop people from reaching whatever lay ahead. Boone had known. Somehow the dog had sensed the danger before they'd stumbled into it. Had stopped Garrett before he'd led them both into the spike trap. "Good boy," Garrett said quietly. His hand was shaking as he reached out to touch the dog's shoulder. "Good boy. You just saved both our lives." They circled wide around the clearing, giving the trap a berth of at least 30 meters. Garrett marked its position in his mind, a mental map forming of a landscape that was actively hostile. Someone didn't want people traveling this direction. Someone was willing to maim or kill to keep them away. The question was why. They descended into a narrow valley following a game trail that Boone seemed to recognize. The snow here was less deep, protected by the dense canopy overhead. The walking became easier, but Garrett's unease grew with every step. He'd been in places like this before, places where the air itself felt wrong, where your gut told you that danger was close, even if your eyes couldn't find it. The Hindu Kush had felt like this. Certain neighborhoods in Fallujah had felt like this. Places where violence had soaked into the ground and changed the fundamental nature of the space. It was just past 1 in the afternoon when Boone stopped so abruptly that Garrett almost tripped over him. The dog's whole body quivered. Recognition mixed with grief showed in every line of his body. "What is it?" The dog whined, a high keening sound that Garrett had never heard from him before. Then Boone moved forward slowly, his head low, and disappeared behind a jumble of fallen boulders. Garrett followed, the rifle leading. He came around the rocks and stopped. A backpack. Green canvas military surplus, half buried in the snow and wedged against the base of the largest boulder. It had been here for weeks, maybe months. Long enough for snow to accumulate and ice to form on the fabric. Garrett knelt and pulled it free. The weight was wrong, too light. Whatever had been inside was mostly gone. He unzipped the main compartment carefully, half expecting to find something terrible. Papers, a water bottle frozen solid and cracked, a granola bar untouched, and at the bottom, a laminated ID card. Garrett pulled it out and turned it over. The face that stared back at him from the photo was a woman in her early 30s. Blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Blue eyes with smile lines at the corners. A Park Service uniform. The text below the photo read, "Marlo Whitaker, Montana State Park Ranger, issued 2019. He opened the papers. A notebook, the kind rangers used to document their patrols. The handwriting was neat and precise. The entries were dated November 8th, received report of missing hiker from family. Eleanor Ashford, 78 years old, last seen 3 weeks ago. Family insists she doesn't hike, doesn't camp. Something wrong with this. November 10th, following dog tracks into North Wilderness area. Tracks are fresh, maybe 2 days old. German Shepherd, judging by paw size. No sign of human tracks accompanying. Why would a dog be out here alone? November 12th. Found evidence of habitation. Old cabin maybe 5 miles ahead. Smoke from chimney. But when I approached, someone watched me from the trees. Not the missing woman. Male. Younger. He didn't want to be seen. Circled back to higher ground. We'll call this in at next radio check. November 13. Radio won't work this deep in. Going to approach cabin tomorrow. Something very wrong here. Someone is following me. Not wildlife. Human. Heard voices last night. 2 men arguing about the old woman and how long they can keep this up. Need to get help. The entry ended mid-sentence. The rest of the page was blank. The rest of the notebook was blank. Garrett's hands were steady as he closed the notebook, but his pulse hammered in his ears. He looked at Boone. The dog sat beside the backpack, his head bowed, his body language speaking of loss. "You knew her," Garrett said softly. "Marlo. She was looking for someone. Looking for whoever owns you. And she found something. Something that got her killed." The dog's eye, that single seeing eye, met his. The grief there was unmistakable and profoundly human in its depth. Garrett carefully placed the notebook and ID back in the pack, but he kept it out. He needed to find Marlo's body. She deserved that much. "Show me where she is," he said to Boone. The dog rose slowly and moved away from the boulder, heading deeper into the small ravine. Garrett followed, dread building in his chest with every step. Boone stopped beside a snow-covered mound. Too regular to be natural, too small to be a fallen tree. Garrett knelt and brushed away the snow with his gloved hand. Canvas fabric appeared. Park Service green. He cleared more snow, working faster now, already knowing what he would find. A body, face down, frozen solid. The back of the skull showed trauma, a depressed fracture, blunt force. Someone had hit her from behind with something heavy, then left her here in the snow to freeze. Marlo Whitaker had made it this far, had tried to call for help, had written that last unfinished entry in her notebook, and someone had murdered her for it, killed her and left her in the snow like garbage. Garrett's hands were shaking as he carefully covered her again. He couldn't carry her out, not with someone dying in that cabin, not with 2 armed men who'd already killed once. But he could remember this spot, could make sure someone came back for her. "I'm sorry," he said to the frozen shape under the snow. "I'm sorry they did this to you, but I promise they'll answer for it." Boone pressed against his leg, trembling. The dog had known, had smelled her even under all that snow and ice. Another loss, another person who had tried to help and died for it. Garrett pulled out his pocket notebook and sketched the location, marked the distinctive boulder formation, noted the GPS coordinates from his watch. Marlo Whitaker deserved better than an unmarked grave in the wilderness. She deserved justice. She deserved to go home. They moved on, but Garrett's jaw was set in a way it hadn't been since Iraq. Someone had done this. Someone had murdered a woman whose only crime was trying to help an old lady in trouble, and that someone was going to pay. The afternoon sun began its early winter descent, the light taking on that golden quality that meant they had maybe 2 hours before dusk. Garrett kept checking his compass, confirming their heading. Due north, just as Boone had indicated from the beginning. The trees thinned as they climbed out of the valley. The ground rose steadily, and Garrett's calves burned with the effort of ascending in deep snow. His breathing came harder, altitude and exertion combining to tax his already exhausted body. Boone, despite his injuries, despite the miles they'd covered, kept moving. The dog's determination was absolute. Whatever drove him forward was stronger than pain, stronger than exhaustion. They crested a rise, and Garrett stopped, his hand coming up to shade his eyes against the glare of sun on snow. Below them, in a small valley cupped between hills, sat a structure. A cabin just as Marlowe's notebook had described. Logs weathered to gray. A stone chimney from which rose that thin line of smoke Garrett had spotted from his grandfather's cabin that morning. A single window dark as a dead eye. And a door wrapped with heavy chain and secured with a padlock. Garrett's stomach dropped. Smoke from the chimney meant someone was inside. A locked door from the outside meant they were a prisoner. He pulled out the compact binoculars from his pack and glassed the cabin carefully. No movement. No tracks in the snow leading to or from the structure. The drifts around the cabin were smooth and undisturbed, meaning no one had approached in at least 2 weeks, probably longer. But that smoke, thin but steady. Someone had fed that fire recently. Someone was alive in there. Boone made a sound, a blend of urgency and relief and desperate hope. The dog took 2 steps down the slope toward the cabin, then looked back at Garrett. "I see it," Garrett said quietly. "I see it, boy. But we have to be smart about this." He scanned the surrounding forest, looking for what he wasn't entirely sure. Movement, vehicles, footprints, anything that might indicate they weren't alone. The forest stared back, silent and impassive. His training said, wait, observe, gather intelligence. Don't walk into an unknown situation. But Marlo Whitaker had waited, had tried to be smart, and someone had killed her for it. The photograph in his jacket pocket seemed to burn against his chest, his grandfather's words from that undelivered letter echoing in his memory. Some debts can only be paid forward. Garrett made his decision. We go in, but we go careful. And if shooting starts, you run. You understand, you get out and you survive. Boone's tail wagged once. Then the dog began moving down the slope, and Garrett followed. They approached from the west, using the terrain for cover. The cabin sat in the clearing like a rotten tooth, dark and unwelcoming. Garrett could see now that the structure was in poor condition. The roof sagged dangerously under the weight of accumulated snow. One wall tilted inward, the logs warped by time and weather. This wasn't someone's home. This was a prison. He motioned for Boone to stay low. The dog obeyed, his body pressed close to the ground as they crept forward. Garrett kept the rifle up, scanning windows, checking corners, looking for any sign of ambush. They reached the edge of the clearing. 50 feet of open ground between them and the cabin door. 50 feet of exposure with nowhere to hide. Garrett's mouth was dry. His finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger itself. This was the moment. This was where Wyatt Coleman had been trapped in that Humvee. This was where every decision mattered. He stepped into the clearing. Nothing happened. No shots. No shouts. Just the whisper of wind and the soft crunch of snow under his boots. He crossed the distance in 20 seconds that felt like 20 minutes. His back itched, expecting a bullet. His ears strained for the sound of a weapon being cocked. But the silence held. Boone was at his side, pressed against his leg, the dog's body tense as a coiled spring. Garrett reached the door. The chain was heavy, industrial grade. The padlock was old but solid. He examined it closely. Rust at the edges, us in the mechanism. It had been here for months. He pulled the rifle back and slammed the butt into the padlock. The impact rang out across the valley, loud as a gunshot. The lock held. He hit it again and again. Metal shrieked against metal. On the fourth strike, the shackle broke free with a sharp crack. The chain fell away, landing in the snow with a muffled clatter. Garrett pulled the hunting knife from his belt and gripped the door handle. Wood warped and frozen. He looked down at Boone. The dog's eye was fixed on the door, his entire body quivering. "Stay behind me," Garrett whispered. He pulled the door open. The smell hit him first. Sickness and unwashed bodies and something else. Fear. The smell of a place where hope had gone to die. He stepped inside, rifle raised, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The cabin's interior was a single room. A table, a chair, empty shelves, a fireplace with dying embers, and in the far corner on a narrow cot, a shape under a pile of thin blankets. Boone didn't wait. The dog rushed past Garrett with a sound that was half bark, half cry. He reached the cot and began frantically nuzzling at the blankets, whining in a voice that broke with emotion. Garrett crossed the room in 3 strides. He pulled back the blankets and his breath caught. A woman, elderly, her white hair matted and dirty, her face so gaunt that the skull showed clearly beneath papery skin. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes were closed, and her left wrist was locked in a metal handcuff, the chain bolted directly to the iron frame of the cot. The skin beneath the cuff was raw meat. She tried to pull free, tried until her wrist was nothing but blood and infection. "Ma'am?" Garrett said, his voice coming out rough. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. He pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. There. Faint and irregular, but there. She was alive. Barely. Boone was licking the woman's free hand, making those heartbreaking sounds of grief and joy mixed together. The dog's tail wagged once, twice. He looked up at Garrett with something like hope. "I've got her," Garrett said. "I've got her boy." He pulled the multi-tool from his belt and examined the handcuff. Standard police issue old model, the lock was simple. He could pick it given time. Time this woman might not have. He worked fast. The pick slid into the mechanism, feeling for the pins. 1, 2, the third one stuck. He applied pressure, gentle and steady. "Come on, come on." The lock clicked open. The handcuff fell away. The woman's arm dropped to her side, limp and lifeless. Garrett carefully examined her wrist. The infection was bad. Red streaks climbing toward her elbow. Blood poisoning. She needed antibiotics, needed a hospital, needed help he couldn't provide. But he could try. He pulled the emergency blanket from his pack, the mylar crinkling as he wrapped it around her emaciated body. Her core temperature was dangerously low. Hypothermia on top of malnutrition on top of infection. The odds were not in her favor. He found his canteen and wet his fingers, touching them to her cracked lips. "Just a little," he murmured. "Just a sip." Her tongue moved weakly, accepting the moisture. A good sign. Unconscious but still responsive to basic stimuli. Boone had climbed onto the cot, curling his body carefully around the woman's, sharing his warmth. The dog's head rested on her shoulder, and he watched Garrett with an expression that clearly said, "Fix this. Save her." "I'm trying," Garrett said. He stood and quickly searched the rest of the cabin, looking for answers, looking for anything that might tell him who this woman was and why someone had done this to her. On the rickety table he found it, a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen with damp. He opened it carefully and read the first entry. "September 15th. My nephew Vaughn brought me to this cabin today. Said it would be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the city. I was so pleased. I thought he finally wanted to spend time with his old aunt." Garrett flipped ahead. "September 18th. He won't let me leave. He knows about the land, about the survey last year that found lithium. Tens of millions of dollars, he said. He wants the deed. He wants me to sign everything over to him. I told him no. I told him that land was meant for something better. He locked the door. He locked me in. Further ahead, October 3rd, he brought his brother today. Darius, the 2 of them. They hurt Boone in front of me. My sweet boy. They wanted to show me what would happen if I didn't cooperate. I signed a false document. I told them anything to make them stop hurting him. But they knew it was fake." Darius laughed. He said they had time. They could wait for me to break. Garrett's jaw clenched. He forced himself to keep reading. October 28th, a ranger came looking. I heard her calling my name. I screamed for help, but she couldn't hear me. Darius went out. I heard arguing. Then a single gunshot. He came back and told Vaughn to bury her deep. They talked about me like I wasn't there, like I was already dead. November 15th. Boone escaped last night. I don't know how. Darius had tied him outside as punishment. But when they went to check this morning, he was gone. I pray he finds someone. I pray God sends someone to help. I don't have much time left. My wrist is infected. I can feel the fever. But if someone finds this, please tell them I never gave up. I never stopped fighting. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago. Garrett was about to close the journal when he noticed something. A loose page tucked into the back cover. Older paper, different handwriting. He pulled it out carefully. It was a letter, unfinished. The ink faded but still legible. My dearest Silas, if anyone finds this, please tell him I never stopped waiting. They told me you died in the jungle in 1973. They sent me a telegram and a folded flag, and I had no reason to doubt it. So I ran. I couldn't bear to stay in a place where every corner held memories of you. I changed my name, started over, built a new life, but I never loved anyone else. How could I? You were the only man who ever truly saw me. I kept the land, the property your father left to both of us, the one we were supposed to build our future on. I told myself I was keeping it safe for the life we should have had. Now my nephew wants it, wants to tear it apart for profit. I won't let him. This land is all I have left of you, of us, of the future we were supposed to. The letter ended there, unfinished like so many things in this woman's life. Garrett's hands went numb. The letter fell from his fingers, drifting to the cabin floor like a leaf. Silas. His grandfather's name was Silas. He pulled the photograph from his jacket pocket with shaking hands. The young woman with dark hair and the secret smile. He'd seen that face before, in old family albums, in stories his father told about the woman his grandfather had loved and lost in Vietnam. Not lost in Vietnam. Lost to a lie, to a mistake, to a war that had taken so much from so many. Garrett looked at the woman on the cot, 78 years old, white-haired and skeletal. But the bone structure was the same. The shape of her face, the curve of her jaw, Iris. This was Iris. The woman his grandfather had searched for. The woman he'd mourned for 50 years. The woman who had been alive the entire time, grieving for a man who hadn't died. God, Garrett whispered. The word was prayer and curse and shock all at once. His grandfather had died 3 years ago. 3 years. If he'd come to this mountain just a little sooner. If he'd been braver. If he'd trusted his gut about the old stories. But he hadn't. And Silas Hayes had gone to his grave thinking the love of his life was dead. Never knowing she was alive. Never knowing she'd waited. Garrett's throat burned. His eyes stung. He hadn't cried since Wyatt Coleman's funeral. Hadn't let himself feel that depth of grief. But kneeling in this miserable cabin, looking at this dying woman who should have been his grandmother, the dam broke. I'm sorry, he said to Iris's unconscious form. God, I'm so sorry. He looked for you. He never stopped looking. And I'm his grandson. I'm here. He sent me. Somehow he sent me. Boone whined softly, his head pressing against Garrett's shoulder. Garrett wiped his eyes roughly and stood. He couldn't fall apart. Not now. Iris needed him. Marlowe needed justice. And somewhere out there, 2 men who'd done all of this were still free. He carefully placed both the journal and the letter in his pack. Evidence. All of it was evidence. When they got out of here, if they got out of here, someone would need to see this. He was checking Iris's vital signs again when he heard it. Faint at first, then growing louder. An engine. A truck engine struggling through deep snow. Boone's head shot up. A growl started low in his chest. Garrett moved to the window and peered out carefully. Coming down the trail from the north, barely visible through the trees. A pickup truck. Dark blue. 2 figures visible in the cab. They were coming back. Garrett's mind shifted into combat mode. The calm that came over him in moments like this was familiar. The fear was still there, buried under layers of training, but it didn't control him. Not anymore. He had seconds to make a decision. Minutes at most. Option 1, run. Grab Iris Oris. Get Boone disappear into the forest. But Iris couldn't walk. Couldn't even wake up. Carrying her through deep snow with 2 armed men hunting them would be suicide. And Boone's injuries, though, healing weren't healed. They'd be caught within an hour. Option 2, stay. Fight. Use the cabin for cover. He had the rifle. Had the high ground advantage. Had surprise on his side. They didn't know anyone was here. The broken lock was on the ground, hidden in shadow. He could wait until they opened the door, take them both down before they understood what was happening. But could he shoot 2 men in cold blood, even knowing what they'd done? The answer came faster than he expected. Yes. For Marlowe Whitaker, frozen in the snow. For Iris Ashford, handcuffed to a bed and left to starve. For Boone, beaten and tortured and left to die. Yes, he could. The truck was closer now, maybe 200 meters out. He could hear the engine clearly, the grind of gears as it navigated the rough terrain. Garrett moved fast. He positioned himself to the left of the door, rifle raised, using the wall for cover. From here, he had a clear line of fire on anyone who entered. The Winchester felt solid in his hands, reliable. Just like Silas had promised in the note he'd left with it. "This rifle has never let me down. It won't let you down either." "Boone," he said quietly, "get behind the cot. Stay low, stay quiet. If shooting starts, you protect her. Understand?" The dog looked at him for a long moment. Then, with obvious reluctance, he moved to the cot and lay down beside Iris, his body covering hers like a shield. "Good boy." Garrett's finger rested along the trigger guard. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied. The calm before violence. He'd been here before, in Fallujah, in a dozen firefights. But this time was different. This time he wasn't frozen. This time he wasn't 3 minutes too late. This time he was ready. The truck engine cut off, 2 doors open. Footsteps crunching in snow. Getting closer. Male voices, low conversation. One younger nervous, one older confident. "Told you we should have checked on her last week. She's fine, takes months to starve. We've got time." But the lock, probably just ice. "Stop worrying." The footsteps reached the door. A hand touched the handle. Garrett's finger moved to the trigger. The door began to open, and the Montana wilderness held its breath. The door swung inward. The first man through was young, late 20s, maybe 30, thin-built, nervous energy. He wore a heavy parka and expensive hiking boots that had never seen real trail use. His eyes swept the dark interior of the cabin, not yet adjusted to the dimness. Vaughn Ashford. Had to be. The second man was bigger, mid-30s, broad shoulders, the kind of build that came from labor, not gyms. He carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. His hand rested on something at his belt. Probably a pistol. Darius Ashford, the mastermind. They were 2 steps into the cabin when Darius froze. His eyes had adjusted faster. He'd seen the empty handcuff hanging from the cot, the Mylar emergency blanket that didn't belong here, the medical supplies scattered on the floor. "Something's wrong," Darius said. His hand moved to his belt. Garrett stepped out from behind the wall, the Winchester's barrel pointed at Darius's chest. "Don't," Garrett said. His voice was calm, flat, the voice of someone who'd made peace with what came next. "Hands up, both of you, nice and slow." Vaughn's hands shot up immediately, his face going white. But Darius was different. His eyes narrowed. He was calculating, measuring distances, looking for an opening. "I said hands up," Garrett repeated. "I won't say it again." Darius raised his hands slowly, but his eyes never left Garrett's face. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who found Marlo Whitaker's body," Garrett said. "Someone who read what you did to that woman on the cot. Someone who's going to make sure you answer for all of it." Vaughn made a choking sound. I didn't mean." "Shut up," Darius snapped. Then to Garrett, "You don't know what you're walking into. This is family business. That old woman in there, she's our aunt. We're just what? Starving her, chaining her up, beating her dog, murdering a park ranger." Garrett's voice remained level, but something cold entered it. "I read the journal. I know exactly what you are." Behind the cot, Boone growled, a deep rumbling sound of recognition and rage. The dog had gone rigid, every muscle tensed. Darius's eyes flicked to the dog. Recognition, followed by shock, crossed his face. "That's impossible. I killed that mutt. I tied him to a tree and—" "You failed," Garrett said. "He made it 15 miles through a blizzard to find help. Led me straight back here." Darius's expression hardened. The calculation was done. He'd made his decision. "Vaughn," he said quietly, "when I move, you run." "Don't," Garrett warned. His finger was on the trigger now. "Don't make me." Darius lunged sideways, his hand grabbing for the pistol at his belt. Vaughn bolted for the door. And in that split second, Garrett had to choose. He swung the rifle toward Darius, the greater threat, the armed one, and fired. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. The bullet caught Darius high in the shoulder, spinning him around. The pistol clattered to the floor. Darius screamed and went down. Vaughn made it through the door. Garrett could have shot him. Should have, maybe. The man was getting away. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the look of pure terror on Vaughn's face. Maybe it was the knowledge that shooting a fleeing unarmed man in the back crossed a line Garrett wasn't ready to cross. He let him run. Darius was on the ground, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, but the wound wasn't fatal. Garrett had aimed to disable, not to kill. Years of training even in the heat of the moment. Garrett crossed to him quickly and kicked the fallen pistol away. He pulled zip ties from his pack. Military habit always carried restraints and secured Darius's hands behind his back. The man cursed and struggled, but the shoulder wound had taken the fight out of him. "You're going to bleed out," Darius spat. "You shot me. I'm dying." "You're not," Garrett said coldly. He pulled a compress from his first aid kit and stuffed it against the wound. "It's a through and through, missed everything vital. You'll live long enough to stand trial." He glanced at the door. Vaughn was long gone, his footsteps fading into the forest, but he was running blindly in deep snow without supplies or weapons. He wouldn't get far, and Garrett had bigger concerns. He turned to the cot where Iris lay. Boone was still there, still protecting her, but the dog's eyes were on Garrett now, waiting, trusting. "She needs a hospital," Garrett said, to Boone, to himself, to whoever might be listening. "She needs it now." His radio. He'd brought the emergency radio. It was supposed to work anywhere in the state, satellite linked for search and rescue. He pulled it from his pack and powered it on. Static, then a voice crackling but clear. "This is Montana State Emergency Services. Identify yourself." "This is Garrett Hayes." He gave his location as best he could estimate. "I need immediate medical evacuation. I have a critical patient. Elderly female, severe malnutrition, hypothermia, infected wounds. And I need law enforcement. I have a suspect in custody for murder and kidnapping." There was a pause, then, "Copy that. We're dispatching a helicopter, ETA 25 minutes. Can you maintain the situation until then?" Garrett looked at Darius, zip-tied and bleeding on the floor, at Iris, barely breathing, at Boone, loyally standing guard. "I can maintain," he said. 25 minutes had never felt so long. Garrett used the time efficiently. He redressed Iris's wounds, gave her careful sips of water, checked her vital signs every few minutes. Her pulse remained weak but steady. She was a fighter. Had to be to survive this long. Boone wouldn't leave her side. The dog had curled up against her again, his warmth helping to stabilize her core temperature. Every so often he would look up at Garrett with an expression that was almost human in its worry. "She's going to make it," Garrett told him. "We got here in time." He hoped he was telling the truth. Darius had gone quiet, slumped against the wall. The blood loss wasn't life-threatening, but it was enough to keep him docile. He watched Garrett with eyes full of calculation and hate. "You don't know what you're messing with," Darius said finally. "That land is worth $50 million. The lithium deposit—" "I don't care," Garrett cut him off. "You tortured your own aunt for money. You killed a woman who was trying to help. You beat a dog and left him to die." He shook his head. "There's not enough money in the world to justify what you did." "She wouldn't give it up," Darius said. His voice held a note of genuine grievance, as if Iris was the unreasonable one. "All that land just sitting there? She wasn't using it. What was the point?" "The point," Garrett said quietly, "is that it was hers, not yours, and she was keeping it for someone." He thought of the unfinished letter, of Silas waiting 50 years for a woman he thought was dead, of Iris keeping the land safe for a future that never came. "She was keeping it for the man she loved," Garrett continued, "the man who died, who she thought died in Vietnam. Your aunt spent 50 years grieving for him, and you wanted to tear apart the only thing she had left of him, for profit." Something flickered in Darius's eyes. Shame, maybe, or just anger at being caught. It was hard to tell. The sound of rotor blades cut through the silence. The helicopter was early, or maybe time had moved faster than Garrett realized. He went to the door and stepped outside. The helicopter was circling, looking for a place to land. Garrett pulled out the signal flare from his pack and lit it. Red smoke billowed up into the clear winter sky. The helicopter descended into the clearing. The downdraft from its blades created a miniature blizzard, whipping snow and loose debris into a frenzy. Two flight medics jumped out before the skids even touched down, carrying a stretcher. "Inside," Garrett shouted over the roar of the engine. "Critical patient on the cot." They moved fast, professional and efficient. Within 2 minutes, they had Iris on the stretcher, IV started, oxygen mask in place. One of the medics looked up at Garrett. "You saved her life," he said. "Another day, and she'd have been gone." Garrett just nodded. He couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. They loaded Iris into the helicopter. Boone tried to follow, whining desperately as they took his person away. Garrett put a hand on the dog's collar. "She's going to be okay," he said. "We'll see her soon, I promise." The medic looked at Boone, then at Garrett. "The dog can come if you want. There's room." Garrett shook his head. "I need to stay. There's a suspect in the cabin and another one loose in the woods. I can't leave until law enforcement gets here." "Sheriff's en route," the medic said. "Should be here within the hour. Snowmobiles." The helicopter lifted off. Garrett and Boone stood side by side, watching it disappear into the pale blue sky. When the sound of the rotors finally faded, the silence of the mountains returned. But it felt different now, less oppressive, as if something that had been broken was starting to heal. Garrett went back inside. Darius was still slumped against the wall, looking diminished somehow, smaller. The adrenaline and bravado had drained away, leaving just a man who'd made terrible choices and would now face their consequences. "Where will Vaughn go?" Garrett asked. Darius looked up. "He's got no survival skills, no sense of direction. He'll probably try to make it back to the truck." A bitter laugh. "If he doesn't freeze first." Garrett considered this. Vaughn was a killer too. He'd been part of this from the beginning. But the thought of the man freezing to death in the wilderness didn't sit right. It was too close to what they'd done to Iris. "I'm going to look for him," Garrett said. He secured Darius to the cot frame with additional zip ties. "You're not going anywhere." Boone was already at the door, ready to help. The dog's nose would make short work of tracking Vaughn's path. They found him 40 minutes later, huddled behind a fallen log less than a mile from the cabin. He was shivering violently, his expensive parka soaked through with sweat that had turned to ice. His hands were blue with frostbite. He looked up at Garrett with eyes full of terror and relief. "Please," Vaughn whispered, "please don't leave me here." Garrett stared at him for a long moment. This man had helped imprison Iris, had helped kill Marlowe, deserved in some cosmic sense to face the same cold and fear he'd inflicted on others. But Garrett wasn't like them. That was the whole point. "Get up," he said. "You're under arrest." He half-carried Vaughn back to the cabin, Boone trotting alongside. By the time they arrived, the sound of snowmobile engines echoed through the valley. Sheriff Clayton Burke was a man in his late 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life in Montana winters. He took one look at the scene. Two men restrained Garrett, standing with the rifle, Boone sitting alert at his side, and nodded slowly. "Hell of a situation," he said. "You have no idea," Garrett replied. It took another 3 hours to process everything. Garrett gave his statement, showed them Marlowe's body, handed over the journal and the notebook, explained about Boone and the journey through the wilderness and finding Iris chained in the cabin. The sheriff listened to all of it without interrupting. When Garrett finished, Burke was quiet for a moment. "Marlowe Whitaker was a friend of mine," he said finally. "Good ranger, good person. She deserves justice." "She'll get it," Garrett said. Burke looked at Darius and Vaughn, both now in handcuffs and loaded onto snowmobiles for transport. "Yeah, she will." Before they left, Burke turned to Garrett. "That woman you saved, Iris Ashford, you know who she is to you?" Garrett nodded slowly. "My grandfather's fiancée, the woman he thought died 50 years ago." "Your grandfather was Silas Hayes?" "Yes." Burke smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I knew Silas. He used to come into town once a month for supplies. Never talked much. But one night after he'd had a few drinks, he told me about a woman named Iris. Said she was the only one who ever mattered. Said he'd looked for her for 20 years before he finally gave up." Garrett felt something twist in his chest. "He never knew she was alive." "No," Burke agreed. "He didn't. But he'd be proud of you for finishing what he couldn't." They shook hands. Then Burke and his deputies headed out, taking Darius and Vaughn with them. The valley fell silent again. Garrett stood in front of the cabin, Boone at his side. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. Beautiful and terrible and vast. "Come on, boy," Garrett said. "Let's go home." The journey back to Silas's cabin took 6 hours. They traveled through the night using the moonlight and Garrett's compass to navigate. Boone led the way when the trail was unclear, his instincts unerring even in darkness. They reached the cabin just before dawn. Garrett built up the fire, fed Boone, and collapsed into the armchair. He was asleep before he even realized how exhausted he was. He woke to his phone ringing. Somehow it had signal. He answered groggily. "Mr. Hayes, this is Bozeman Deaconess Hospital. We're calling about Iris Ashford." Garrett's heart seized. She's awake," the nurse said gently. "And she's asking for you. Or rather, she's asking for Boone. But we figured you'd want to know." Garrett stood so fast the chair tipped over. "I'll be there in 3 hours." He made it in 2.5. The hospital room was warm and bright and smelled of antiseptic and flowers. Iris was in the bed, propped up on pillows. She still looked frail, but there was color in her cheeks, life in her eyes. Boone rushed to her side, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. Iris's hands, one heavily bandaged, reached out to touch his head. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered. "You did it. You found help." She looked up at Garrett then. Her eyes were gray, he noticed, the same gray as the winter sky. "You must be the one who saved us," she said. "We saved each other," Garrett replied. He pulled up a chair and sat. "Ma'am, there is something I need to tell you about who I am, about my grandfather." He told her everything, about Silas, about the cabin, about the photograph and the letter, about 50 years of searching and grief and love that never died. Iris listened with tears streaming down her face. When he finished, she reached out with her good hand and took his. "He didn't die," she whispered. "All these years, he didn't die." "No, ma'am, but he did look for you until the day he passed. He never stopped." "I kept the land for him," Iris said. "For us. I always thought, I always hoped." She couldn't finish. Garrett squeezed her hand gently. "He would want you to have it, to do what you think is right with it." Iris was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at Boone still pressed against her side and at Garrett. "I know exactly what to do with it," she said. 6 months later, the David and Eleanor Foundation broke ground on its first project. The $50 million from the lithium rights sold to an ethical mining company with strict environmental protections would fund a comprehensive support network for veterans struggling with PTSD and for animal rescue organizations across Montana. The foundation's headquarters sat on a corner of Iris's land in a new building designed to blend into the landscape. But the heart of it was still Silas's old cabin, preserved and expanded, turned into a retreat center where veterans and rescue animals could heal together. Garrett lived there now. He was the foundation's first director, though he'd never planned to be. It had just sort of happened. Iris had asked, he'd said yes, and somewhere in the process of building something good out of so much pain, he'd found the thing he'd been looking for in the Montana wilderness: purpose. Iris lived there too, in a small house built near the cabin. She and Garrett had dinner together most nights. They'd talk about Silas, about the life that should have been, about the life they were building now. Boone split his time between them, loyal to both. But mostly he worked. The foundation had started a therapy dog program, training rescue animals to help veterans. Boone was the lead instructor, teaching younger dogs through example. It was spring now. The snow had melted. Wildflowers dotted the meadow around the cabin in bursts of purple and yellow. Garrett sat on the porch swing, a cold beer in hand, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Boone trotted up the steps and sat beside him, resting his head on Garrett's knee. "Good day, boy," Garrett asked. The dog's tail thumped against the wooden boards. From inside the cabin came the sound of laughter. A group of veterans had arrived that morning for a week-long retreat. 3 men and 2 women, all carrying wounds that didn't show. By the end of the week, each of them would be paired with a rescue dog, would start the slow process of healing that Garrett himself had only just begun. Iris emerged from her house, walking slowly but steadily. She'd gained weight, gotten stronger. The doctor said it was remarkable given what she'd endured. Garrett thought it was just stubbornness, the same quality that had kept her alive in that cabin. She settled into the chair next to the swing. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade. "Do you think he'd approve?" Iris asked finally. "Silas, do you think this is what he would have wanted?" Garrett thought about his grandfather who'd built a cabin in the wilderness as a refuge, who'd spent 50 years mourning a lost love, who'd left behind a letter and a photograph and a grandson he'd hoped might understand. "I think," Garrett said slowly, "he'd say we turned a tragedy into something good, that we didn't let the bad guys win, that we saved the things worth saving." Iris smiled. He always was practical. From the cabin, one of the veterans called out. Dinner was ready. Would they join? They would. Garrett stood and offered Iris his arm. Together with Boone walking beside them, they went inside. The cabin that Silas built had been meant as an ending, a place to hide from the world's pain. But in the hands of his grandson and the woman he'd loved, it had become a beginning. A place where broken things could be made whole, where debts were paid forward, where a German shepherd's loyalty and a Marine's guilt and an old woman's love had combined to create something that would outlast them all. The mountains kept their secrets. But sometimes if you listened carefully enough, if you trusted the signs, if you followed a wounded animal through a blizzard on nothing but faith, sometimes those secrets turned into miracles. And sometimes, just sometimes, the wilderness gave back what it had taken. As the sun slipped below the horizon and stars began to emerge in the Montana sky, Garrett Hayes understood something his grandfather had learned too late, and Iris had known all along: you couldn't outrun the past. But you could honor it. You could take the broken pieces and build something beautiful. You could turn grief into grace. You could go home, not to the place you'd left behind, but to the place you'd been searching for all along. The place where forgiveness lived, where redemption waited, where love, even love that seemed lost forever, could find its way back. Garrett looked at Boone, who looked back with that one seeing eye full of ancient wisdom and absolute trust. "Thank you," Garrett said quietly, "for leading me here, for not giving up." The dog's tail wagged, just once, but it was enough. It had always been enough.